From time to time, we receive letters at headquarters in Brooklyn, New York, that are especially heartfelt. I have one such letter here. I'd like to read it to you. And as I do, please know that these are the sister's own words, but see if you can't identify with what she says. Now, your circumstances may be different, but see if you, on any level, can identify with her feelings, okay? She writes, "We recently returned from our circuit assembly dealing with carrying our own loads. The advice was very timely. I deeply appreciate the loving care that Jehovah's organization has been taking of us little sheep for many years, alerting us to what we must do. It strikes me as very ironic, though, that often the ones who leave such assemblies with their consciences really pained are those who are stretched out to the max. In fact, I was left very depressed. Now I fully realize that this is my problem, not yours, dear brothers. I obviously took it wrong. But I left feeling woefully inadequate. I pray often to Jehovah to correct my thinking. Guilt is such a damaging emotion, and I can tell you that it affects many fine brothers and sisters. Why can't we, why don't we do more in service? It is not always a lack of faith or devotion, brothers. Do you know how time-consuming poverty is? I am a mother of 3. I drive our children to and from school. They are in 3 different schools. This time is extremely valuable as we read the text, we pray, we discuss current holidays, pressures, homework, and so forth. But back to the poverty aspect of life. I must conserve wherever I can. This means that I must spend time searching through thrift shops, clearance racks, or sewing clothes so that our family can be suitably attired for field service in our ritzy territories. My 14-year-old son recently acquired the privilege of handling the microphones at the Kingdom Hall, and he needs appropriate suits, shirts, and shoes, which he consistently outgrows every 2 months. We need warm winter clothing brought out of the closets, washed, ironed, and ready for the 5 of us. We strongly agree that mealtimes together are important, and we believe that eating lots of fruits and freshly prepared vegetables are important to staying healthy. But this necessitates my driving 20 miles to a farmer's market. Then I spend an hour or 2 each week working on coupons, cutting, filing, trading them. This results in cutting our grocery store bills 30 to 50%. I don't mean to bore you with my life, brothers, but do you see the problem? I feel very guilty doing all the above, thinking that it could be time spent in service. I feel guilty thinking that the hour I spend writing this letter could have been spent out in service. And soon this downward spiral has me really depressed, and my dear husband is wondering what to do with me. Also, something I never complain about is the extra load that I willingly carry in our household so that my husband can continue serving as an elder. I absolutely know that Jehovah's blessing has been rich on our family because of his serving, and I do not begrudge what he gives. I always remember the quote in a Watchtower experience of a mother advising her newly married daughter, "Never be jealous of Jehovah." Yet realistically, I need to rake more leaves, do more studying, homework, transportation with the children, because my husband is busy. This is something I cannot complain to other wives about because I would never want them to hold their husbands back from progressing. So I silently endure the, "Why aren't you pioneering?" comments, or I feebly try to defend myself. I did auxiliary pioneer last September, but I fell so far behind on the paperwork, housework, laundry, it took 2 months to put the house back together. Now, maybe I'm disorganized, Somehow I cannot seem to get it together like the sisters I read about who pioneer with 5 children, a full-time job, and an unbelieving husband. So instead, I feel enormously guilty and unworthy of Jehovah's favor. The problems of depression are so serious today. If a mother falls into this hole, the entire family can suffer physically, emotionally, spiritually. There must be some way to lift the guilt off of many diligent, hard-working brothers and sisters who are stretched to the limit. You don't need to reply to this letter. I've already taken your time away from important spiritual things. With Jehovah's sustaining power, we will all resist Satan's devious attacks on our minds, our families, and our congregations. And then she signs the letter. I mean, can you identify with her feelings? Have you ever felt that way, guilty, that maybe you're not doing enough to please Jehovah? Now, maybe it's not poverty that limits you. Maybe it's health, family responsibilities, advancing age that limits you. But when you're not able to do all that your heart yearns to do in serving Jehovah, it is so easy to feel guilty. Guilt can actually displace love as our motive in serving God. Now, let me make clear, I'm not talking about someone who chooses to do less because he's distracted by the things of the world. When the elders see situations like that, they rightly offer some help, some counsel. Now, I'm talking about the conscientious Christian who really yearns to do more, but who beats himself up because he can't. Now, that raises several questions. First, what does Jehovah expect of us? Second, why is it so easy to feel guilty about our service to God? And then third, how can you know if you're doing enough to please God? Well, first off, what does Jehovah really want from us? To answer that, let's take a close look at a very touching Bible account found at Mark chapter 14. Now, the setting here, it's Nisan the 9th, about 5 days before Jesus died. Mark 14, and we'll start reading with verse 3. And while he, that is Jesus, was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the meal, a woman came with an alabaster case of perfumed oil, genuine nard, very expensive. Breaking open the alabaster case, she began to pour it upon his head. At this there was some expressing indignation among themselves. Why has this waste of the perfumed oil taken place? For this perfumed oil could have been sold for upward of 300 denarii and been given to the poor. And they were feeling great displeasure at her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you make trouble for her? She did a fine deed toward me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want to, you can always do them good. But me you do not have always." She did what she could. She undertook beforehand to put perfumed oil on my body in view of the burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the good news is preached in all the world, what this woman did shall also be told as a remembrance of her. Now let's go back and take a close look at this beautiful account. In verse 3, it says that this meal took place at the house of a certain Simon the leper. Now, obviously, that does not mean that Simon was a leper at that time. I mean, otherwise he would have been unclean. Evidently, it means Simon had been or used to be a leper and probably had been healed by Jesus. And now Jesus was a guest in this man's home. It says also in verse 3 that a woman came in with the oil. Now, this woman is not named in Mark's account, but in the parallel account in John chapter 12, this woman is named. And do you remember who this was? Someone like to render a guess? Who was this woman? Okay, please. Now, Mary is correct, and it's also a safe answer. Because there are 6 Marys in the Bible. Which one was this? Well, it's very helpful to know because it gives added perspective to what she did. This was Mary, the sister of Lazarus. And Jesus had already resurrected her brother from the dead. Now you just put yourself in Mary's place. What would you have been willing to do for the man who had given you your brother back from the dead? Now it says at the latter part of verse 3, she poured this oil upon Jesus' head. Now, it's very interesting. Mark and Matthew, in their accounts of this, say head. But in the parallel account in John, John says that she poured the oil on Jesus' feet. Now, is that a contradiction? Of course not. Obviously, what it means is she poured the oil both on Jesus' head and on his feet. Now, one scholar says this: to pour ointment on the head was common. To pour it on the feet was an act of distinguished humility and attachment to the Savior. But again, there wasn't enough that she could do for this man who had given her brother back from the dead. Now, not everybody was happy with what she did. In verse 4, it says there were some expressing indignation. And the parallel account in John makes very clear who the ringleader of this was. And you know who it was, right? It was Judas. Now, among the reasons given at the latter part of in verse 5 is that the oil could have been sold and given to the poor. Now, is that really what Judas had in mind? No. He was the keeper of the money box, right? So if the oil had been sold with the idea of giving the money to the poor, right, upon selling the oil, the money would first have been put into the box, and then from the box given to the poor. So Judas had been figuring with his sticky fingers he could have helped himself to the money. Now, we're talking about a considerable sum of money here, right? It says upward of 300 denarii. That's what this oil was worth. Now, when you remember that the average working man in the first century earned 1 denarius a day, and if you subtract the weekly Sabbath as a workday, this is about a year's wages. And just to put into some perspective the purchasing power of that much money, there's an interesting count in John chapter 6. You remember the account when Jesus was going to feed 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes? Well, the account in John 6 says that they were in an area where Philip was from. And on that occasion, Jesus turned to Philip and he said, "Philip, where can we get some food to feed these people?" And if you make a note to check it, at John 6, verse 7, Philip looks at Jesus and he says, "Lord, 200 denarii would hardly be enough to feed all these people." Now, it was a crowd of 5,000 men, not counting women and children, so easily over 10,000 people. And according to Philip, 200 denarii would not have been quite enough to feed 10,000 or more people. Mary's oil cost a third more than that. Now, where she got it, we don't know. All we do know is that she used it on Jesus. Now, what we're most interested in here is how Jesus felt about what Mary had done. And it's our theme words in verse 8. Jesus says, she did what she could. Now, what did Jesus mean by that? In English, if you say to someone, just do what you can, it can almost have a negative connotation, right? When you say that in English, it can almost sound like, don't push yourself. Just do what you can. You think that's what Jesus meant about Mary? No. Some other Bible translations render these words, she has done all she could. Another says, she has done all that she had it in her power to do. In other words, Mary did not hold back one drop of that precious oil. She used it all on Jesus, and Jesus appreciated it. Now, very interestingly, 2 days later, on Nisan the 11th, Jesus spent the whole day at the temple teaching, and during the course of that day, he sat opposite the treasury chest, and he saw another woman come in, a very poor widow. And the Bible says that widow dropped into the treasury chest 2 small coins of very little value. Now, what is so beautiful, friends, is that when you read in the Bible what Jesus said about the widow, you clearly see that he valued her 2 coins just as much as he valued Mary's costly oil. Why? Because that widow did all that she could. Now, what do we learn from these Bible accounts? Well, if you remember that Jesus perfectly reflected Jehovah's way of thinking, the lesson is that when it comes to what we give to God, Jehovah expects us to do all that we realistically can do. Nothing more, nothing less. But now this brings me to the second question. Why is it so easy to feel so guilty about our service to God? Well, there might be several factors. For some, the guilt may stem from feelings of unworthiness. And perhaps those feelings are a direct result of things we've experienced in life, or the way we've been treated by others in life. But if you're left feeling worthless, it is so easy to become convinced that no matter how much you give to Jehovah, it could not possibly be enough to please him. In other cases, the guilt may come from something we touched on yesterday, and that is perfectionism. I'd like to share an excerpt from another letter. This one came in from a sister who talked about her background. She was raised in an alcoholic home by an abusive father. In the beginning of the letter, she talks about how this horrible man would make his children sit on the sofa and watch while he beat their mother. And as children raised in such an environment will often do, they take responsibility for what their parents are doing. And this little girl remembers feeling that she had to be perfect as a child. She reasoned in her little mind, well, if I'm the perfect child, then maybe I won't upset my father, and if he doesn't get upset, then he won't drink. If he doesn't drink, then he won't beat my mom. Well, she grows up, she gets baptized, comes into the truth, and guess what she brought into the truth with her? Her need to be perfect. And in the letter, she explains this. I always feel the need to be perfect in everything that I do. If I'm behind on my goals for the year, I push myself beyond the limit to make those goals, even though I allow my brothers and sisters to be reasonable with themselves. It's next to impossible for me to be sick without feeling tremendous guilt that I'm not exerting myself vigorously enough with the end so near. I do not expect this from my brothers and sisters. After all, Jehovah only expects from them what they can give. I always feel that Jehovah expects more of me. So sometimes the guilt may stem from perfectionism. In many other cases, the guilt may simply come from an unrealistic view of what Jehovah actually wants from us. You know, sometimes, friends, we might actually imagine that Jehovah demands more than he actually does. The Watchtower once touched on this. This is back in December 1st, 1995, page 12. The Watchtower said this: "Why do some feel very guilty about not being able to do more? For some, inappropriate guilt may result from an unrealistic view of what Jehovah expects of us. I had felt that unless it hurts, you must not be doing enough," admitted one Christian. As a result, she set excessively high standards for herself, and then she felt even guiltier when she was unable to reach them. But now, is that what Jesus said about Mary, about the widow? Did he say we've got to serve Jehovah until it hurts with nothing left over for ourselves? No. Jesus indicated that Jehovah expects us simply to do all that we realistically can do. Nothing more, nothing less. But there might be a big difference between what you would like to do and what you realistically can do. Now, I'm sure there are many of you here this morning who would love to perhaps be at Bethel, or maybe in some other branch of the full-time ministry. But maybe you can't. And perhaps the reason you can't is because of family responsibilities. Maybe you're raising small children. Or maybe it's advancing age that has imposed limitations on you. Or maybe it's health that limits you. And just to illustrate how limiting a health issue can be, one final letter. This sister wrote in a few years ago, and here's what she said. "I have a syndrome called fibromyalgia. Because of the chronic pain I own witness, brothers. For the first time in 6 months, I'm reporting my time. Work, though, during the preceding 6 months, I placed magazines on the bus and I did a little informal witnessing to my workmates. It never amounted to much, but I did what I could. Unfortunately, I never reported the time or the placements. But now, I've had to quit work because I am in too much pain, and I try to save my energy to attend the meetings or to listen over the phone. I try to do personal study when I can concentrate too. I don't know where I would be without Jehovah, brothers. Most likely, I would have committed suicide because of the stress." This sister is 18 years old. Now, could any of us say that her service to God is not whole-souled, because maybe it resembles more the widow's coins than Mary's costly oil? No. Who of us could say that? No. When you do all that it is in your power to do, as long as it's your best, then your service is whole-souled, just as whole-souled as that of someone in the full-time ministry. One final question. How can you know if you are doing enough to please God? Well, you know, as we touched on yesterday in our discussion about reasonableness, this is one of those questions where you may not be the best judge of that for yourself. Because when we feel inadequate about ourselves or about what we're doing, it's so much easier to be understanding of others, but then merciless or rigid with ourselves. So here's another case where you may need to talk to someone, maybe a mature sister or brother, an elder here in the congregation, someone who knows you, your abilities, your limitations, your family responsibilities. Review your schedule together. The objective comments of someone you trust can help you to put into proper perspective what you can realistically do in serving God. So what does Jehovah expect of us? Well, from the words of Jesus about Mary, Jehovah expects us to do what we can, all that we realistically can do. Nothing more, nothing less. Why do some feel so guilty about their service to God? Well, the guilt might come from feelings of unworthiness, might come from the need to be perfect, might come from simply an unrealistic view of what Jehovah expects of us. Remember, sometimes we might imagine that Jehovah demands more than he actually does. How can you know if you're personally doing enough to please God? Ask a trusted friend for some perspective. But never forget this. Your worth as a person in the eyes of Jehovah God is not measured solely by what you do, but by who and what you are inside, in your heart. When you do all that you realistically can do, whether it could be compared to the widow's coins or Mary's costly oil, as long as it is your best, Jehovah is pleased, and there's no reason for you to feel guilty. And if you can shed the guilt, then the joy in serving God can return. And the reality is that when you enjoy your service to God, no one needs to tell you how much you should do. Your heart will impel you to do as much, not as little as you realistically can do. So if waves of inappropriate guilt should wash over your heart from time to time, never forget what Jesus said of Mary. She did what she could. And that's all that Jehovah wants from all of us. Thank you.